However you are and whenever you are, welcome back everyone to Coffee and UFOs. After a little bit of a hiatus, we are back with a great guest, Christopher Johnston, and we're going to be talking about the Roswell incident, 1947, but from a different angle and from the perspective of an attorney who wrote a fictional novel to explore that space. So really fascinating, for me, totally novel approach to the Roswell case. So I'm excited to share that with you. Jump in the comment section and share your questions because I'm sure you'll have plenty for Christopher tonight. As a friendly reminder, this podcast is rebroadcast on the UNX network, 11 p.m. Eastern time and 2 a.m. Pacific time every Thursday night and Friday morning. And then this podcast will be posted on iTunes or any other platform you listen to your podcast on tomorrow morning, Friday mornings. Let's see. So we have a lot to talk about in the world of news. And I think I'm going to focus on that more next week because I really want to get as much time out of Christopher as we can tonight. So let me just jump into it and bring Chris on now. Chris, welcome. How are you?
Hey, Alan. Thanks for having me. I'm great.
That's awesome.
Out there. Yeah.
Yeah. So you wrote a book called Roswell: The Truth on Trial.
Right.
And in your words, it reimagines the legendary 1947 UFO crash.
Right.
Before we dig in deep on that, can you give us a little bit of a primer how you came to study this and write about it?
Sure. And if you don't mind a kind of a long primer, you'll find I talk a lot, like a lot of us lawyers do. So, and I always preface this because I think, right now you say Roswell and large, huge swaths of our population. Oh yeah, of course, Roswell, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. But although the events happened in 1947, it wasn't really until the 1970s when Stanton Friedman got his hands into Roswell and really started digging in that Roswell kind of became what it is now, and we all know about it.
Yeah.
So the reason I bring that up, so I'm 55. I was born in '69, so I was a kid, right in the heart of the real beginning of the social touchstone of UFOs. And my dad was, some dads fish and some play baseball. No, my dad talked about UFOs, watched anything, and at the time there was much less, but read anything he could get his hands on. And that was, so the UFO topic, believe it or not, so I bonded with my dad of all the kind of unusual things. Yeah.
Well, my mom and I used to watch the X-Files together.
Perfect. Yeah. And, so then life happens and I developed kind of my own subsets of interest, within the category.
Mm-hmm.
And I now, as you mentioned, so I'm now in my 25th year of being a trial lawyer. So, life happens and, then kids and family and all this. And then, so I maintain the interest and I did a lot of additional coursework.
Chris, I'm going to pause you there real quick. I'm getting some fuzzy and crackling sounds.
Anyway, through that, period of having kids and being busy is all, going get out. I continued. I did coursework in space law. I did some coursework in astrobiology. And then one day the kids were gone, right? And I had all this free time, it seemed like. So I finally had reached that point in life where I could really get into my own hobbies, not necessarily hobbies that are just your kids. And so Roswell, because of that touchstone was the first thing I had heard about. It had always been with me, and I think it's fascinating. And I wanted to write a book. And, especially for an attorney, I am not dry. I'm very creative. I go about, things in a creative manner. And I wanted to write a book, and I wanted it to be a trial primer, but I also wanted an interesting subject matter.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it took the concept took months of that sort of, what can I do? What can I do? And then I realized, one of the things that I like about trial work is what a great way to get evidence and to answer questions, right? You have a direct exam and a cross exam, boom, right there. And I thought, well, what a great way to present Roswell or any of these old, any old mystery. I don't take a position in the book. It's just like a jury. The judge in a trial, the judge, he takes a position. It just simply here's the evidence and you decide. So when I hit upon it, I was like, well, geez, I could do Roswell, as a trial and see what I uncover. So that was the genesis of, why Roswell and why the book.
And when you were writing the book, did you come across any thoughts that you just hit you that hadn't occurred to you before regarding the Roswell event?
Yeah, very late in the day, I didn't anticipate that I would, but I didn't unearth anything, any great, earth-shattering information.
You didn't find the craft.
I did not, but on that point of the craft, taking everything at face value. Mm-hmm. So, you might have got to this question later. I personally, my position, I believe the evidence is there to support an extraterrestrial craft crashed. I do not believe that the evidence supports extraterrestrial bodies. That's just my opinion on it. So, but if we were to take what we've been told along the years, everything from New Mexico was bottled up and it was shipped down to Fort Worth. And from Fort Worth, it went to Wright Pat, is what, that's a fairly widely accepted theory of what went on here.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, I started thinking about it and I was like, well, Wright-Patterson Airfield, and at the time it was two separate ones, but that's what they were about, was sort of aircraft, development, study, research, that sort of thing. So that makes a lot of sense. However, there was not a hospital at Wright-Pat, let alone a morgue or a pathology clinic or anything else until 1952. Mm-hmm. So I just find that interesting and I hadn't heard, I'm not saying this is Chris's own unique. I've never come across that thought. I've never heard it put out there, but I knew somebody that worked at the hospital at Wright Pat. And I mentioned it to him and he's like, didn't exist. I did. So it wasn't even much of a deep dive, but it was accurate. So there was no hospital. So that is a little blip that I kind of think, if there were bodies, you wouldn't have sent them to this Hangar 18. You wouldn't have sent them to Wright Pat. You would have sent them to, Walter Reed in D.C. or the Presidio out in San Francisco, something along those lines. So that's the nugget that I think is pretty neat that I came across.
Yeah, but didn't they have a biological department for studying biologics of some sort?
Not at Wright Pat, not a well-developed, as far as their biologic study, because their stated interest. So again, we have to take things at face value. The government said their stated interest.
And this is only just after the Manhattan Project era. So yeah.
Yeah. So that's what they say. But I just have say you and I, we're the government, we have a couple of these bodies. Are we just going to quickly, well, hey, let's send the craft, just send it all there? No, I just don't think we'd go that way.
Then what way do you think we would go?
Well, as I said, I think if there were extraterrestrials, I think they would have been sent elsewhere. Probably Walter Reed is
probably Walter Reed.
Walter Reed Hospital, right? Mm-hmm. And neither here nor there necessarily. It just begs the question of yet another little wrinkle, if you will.
Understood. Right. And I think that there is a wrinkle with the bodies scenario. Even Kevin Randall, had kind of turned his opinion on that, I don't know, about like 10 years ago or so, towards the fact that maybe there isn't enough evidence. You have a lot of anecdotal, but they're like secondhand anecdotal.
Right. Yeah. And one of the big ones, when it comes to the bodies, people, and this is nobody doing anything bad or nefarious. It's just simply how information gets transmitted and changed and added to, because when it comes to the bodies, most people like to point at Glenn Dennis, who was the local mortician. Uh-huh. And they say, well, Glenn Dennis got this call and asked if he had, 4 child-sized hermetically sealable coffins. And that he had them and he took them to the base. Well, that got added somewhere because Glenn Dennis himself in an interview said that he didn't have the coffins. All right. So he said, I could get the coffins, but I don't have them. Then another wrinkle I find interesting, for reasons unknown, even though he didn't have the coffins, he went to the crash site.
This is why it's good to have a lawyer, because you pay attention to the words.
Right. Yeah. Much to my wife's chagrin. Right. That's, and words are important and they mean something. So, So Glenn Dennis, begs the question, okay, you don't have what they asked, but you decide to go there anyway. That's a little unusual. And then Walter Haut, who was the public information officer. So Walter Haut, I find him interesting in the realm of the bodies as well. So Walter Haut was involved in the drafting of the original press release that a disc was found, and he was involved in the retraction. So we know this happens in 1947. Right. So in 1993, so we're talking, coming up on 50 years after the event, Mr. Haut executed an affidavit about the Roswell incident. 9 years after that, so now we're in 2002, I think it is, he executes a second affidavit. Well, wouldn't you know it, the first one, there is no reference to bodies in that first affidavit, and then it pops up in the second affidavit. And, the way we go about this, and even the way I set it up in my book, on cross-exam, for example, well, Mr. Smith, would you agree with me? Memories don't get better over time, do they? And you kind of get them hung up on that. Sure. So my point is, Haut, you're telling me that you do an affidavit and then you add bodies to it 9 years later, it kind of is burying the lead in my estimation.
Yes, but okay, so then what would be the explanation there?
Well, his explanation was the first affidavit, he wasn't asked about the extraterrestrial, about the bodies. He was just asked about what happened. And so it was a more generalized affidavit.
So he felt maybe perhaps like he was not betraying his oath so much by revealing that. Yeah. Okay.
Sure. Yeah. And not his words, but that's probably a pretty good analysis. Hey, I can say the sun came up. I don't have to say what time necessarily.
Because then the other question you have to ask is, well, why? Why would you say it the second time? Why would you include it the second time?
Yeah. Well, again, his comment was first time he wasn't asked about it. And then a lot of these, these later in life testimonies, that come up, it's usually a variation of the theme of, well, at this point in life, or I need to do what's right as things are winding down. And, okay, maybe not. I'll say this, as I mentioned, my book is a real trial primer if somebody were to read it that way. And, there's, when you go to court, you can't just do whatever. There's rules, and there's rules of evidence. And so like a big one, for example, most people have heard hearsay. Like you can't, I couldn't go to court and say, hey, Alan, tell them what Mike told you, that would be hearsay right there.
Exactly.
So, that talk about a challenge with the book too, with everyone being dead and no physical evidence, I had to make a little fudging with the hearsay rules, but as we were discussing, one of the exceptions to hearsay, there's 7 of them, but 2 of the exceptions that would kind of apply here are what are called excited utterances. So that's an exception to hearsay. Hey, Alan, tell them what Mike told you. Well, first I would have to lay foundation. Alan, tell the jury what Mike was behaving like. Oh, he was all fired up and this and that and that. Okay. And then what? And then he said, okay, so that's an excited utterance exception. So to the hearsay rule. So I kind of look at it and go, okay, well, if the courts were smart enough to consider sometimes people say things differently in different circumstances, then I should probably give them the same benefit of the doubt. There's also an exception, which is called a dying declaration. So the same thing, it has to be the person really has to believe that they're actually dying. So it might not work. But to my point, the courts have determined over the years certain evidence should be treated certain ways, and those late in life testimonies, they not necessarily green lighted, but they're acceptable.
Yeah. And yes, it's true that memory can be distorted. It can fade over time, and you can actually confuse memory. You can actually absorb someone else's memory or experience that they've shared with you, and you incorporate it and you believe it's part of your memory. Especially in the alien abduction cases, that's a very sticky situation, and when you're dealing with recall versus under hypnosis, and then over time, yeah, you're right. I mean, if you talk to Betty and Barney Hill, like the way they phrase things or said things about certain things were a little bit different over the years. But that's perfectly natural. It doesn't mean they're being deceptive necessarily.
Absolutely, right. And I use that a lot. Hey, I'm not saying anyone's malingering. I'm not saying anyone is, or the flip of that is, I believe you believe it. I'm not, I'm not saying that. So,
let's ask you then, do you really believe that an extraterrestrial craft literally crashed in New Mexico?
Based on the evidence, with the evidentiary standards that I applied, yes, I do.
Okay. What is the most important element that you can pull from everything that you've researched that you think stands above the rest as being as close to as empirical of an evidence, to present, like as a lawyer, what would you
Sure.
sit there and go, here, look at this?
Sure. So I set up my book. So in a civil trial, you have the plaintiff and the defendants. Okay. So I'm in my real job, I'm a plaintiff attorney.
Okay.
But for purposes of the book, I structured it as believers and skeptics. Okay. So that's the way I went with it. And I found in this, Alan, you'd asked, I was kind of surprised by this. Throughout the entire book, I never kind of thought this guy would really make my radar, but I believe the best witness for the believers, the guy would be absolutely rock solid, Mac Brazel himself, who is the ranch hand that first found the debris. In my book, I have a whole section on weighing evidence, and I talk about the rules and kind of things that you look at. Mac Brazel, he had no bias. He had no motive, either at the time or later in life. He didn't make money off the deal. He didn't change his story. And in fact, I would paint him as the most honest man you ever wanted. He found the materials and he put it in his truck. And he drove around with it in his truck for a couple of days. He wasn't out to make a name. He wasn't out to do, he was simply doing his thing. And people like that, that's who resonates with jurors, because that's who jurors are. They're your neighbor. They're the normal guy or gal just living down the street. Everybody else, all the cast of characters, maybe they're really young and so they're not that good. Or maybe it's Philip Klass, who's a known skeptic all the time. There's always somebody. But Mac Brazel, rock solid kind of beginning to end, and he touched the materials, he held the materials. So across the board, he's my favorite witness.
You pull him as your witness. Do you think that someone like him would hold up under the scrutiny and pressure? Because in real life, it appears that the Army had intimidated Mac into silence.
Mm-hmm. Objections, speculation. I'll say this. So I practice. So I have an office in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Des Moines, Iowa. And I'm sitting here in Des Moines, Iowa right now. And I have tried plenty of cases, and I'll tell you, my farmer witnesses or the farmer clients, and there's a lot of them here in Iowa, they're unflappable. And that's kind of how I imagine Mr. Brazel, because the farmers, here in Iowa, all they want to do is do their thing and get out of here. They don't want to hear some big story. And when they testify, they don't care if you believe them or not. They're just telling you what happened. So I think, having actually seen those types of folks, or at least how I imagine Mr. Brazel, I imagine he would have done great.
What about Roger Ramey? Don't you think Ramey would eventually, with a good lawyer grilling him, would he be honest and tell the truth? Because he posed, with the fake material, right?
Yeah, and I have some real world opinions about guys like Ramey. So for the skeptics, although Mac Brazel I think is the best witness all the way around, when asked about the skeptics, I usually go with General Ramey. And the reason it's just like I have tried civil rights cases, police brutality types of cases, things like that. And when I first started working on this and seeing the pictures of Ramey, it reminded me of one of those trials. Because let's say you're the offending officer, you might be off work today. It doesn't matter. You show up at court in your Class A, fanciest uniform, every pin you can possibly have. And I get it. I don't like it, but, and so I always, one of the first questions I'd ask is go, are you working today, officer? Well, no, it's just trying to undercut that. But you take a guy like Ramey.
That's clever.
Thank you. Yeah. You take a guy like Ramey, again, he was no slouch. He ran, when the Army Air Force went to split, he went to lead the entire Air Force. I mean, this guy, full uniform, I don't know how many starred general, and he was smart about it. He essentially conceded we made a mistake, right? It was about really all they could do. Yep, I issued the retraction. It was kind of, they made a mistake, so I don't think Ramey, guys like him, I've dealt with guys like him on the stand. Mm-hmm. I think he would have his story. He would stick to it. And yeah, I don't think he'd mind, the best you'd have on Ramey is he would own up that, yes, it was a mistake. Then you'd have to be all over him. Okay, do you really expect these jurors to believe that a guy like you at a nuclear base like this would make that kind of mistake? That's kind of the doubt in there. But I think Ramey would probably stick to whatever the story was.
Right. And I think there's an interesting thing there. So indeed, if they were making a terrible, terrible mistake like that, in the real world, there would be some, reprimanding, reassignment, because that, especially after World War II, it's kind of like after 9/11, there's like a height of national security awareness. And so for him to make such a silly mistake seems just, very odd.
Right. And, if I had really written this book the way a real Roswell trial would have gone, it would have been about 100. I'd still be working on it, right? To hundreds of thousands of pages. But for that exact line of questioning, knowing that's where it would go, you'd start out laying the foundation about how how is it you decide to issue press releases? What information is considered? And you'd get you'd lay out every step of that procedure. Mm-hmm. Then you turn around and start going, oh, okay, and showing where the failings were on the Roswell press release.
Well, Jesse Marcel, he was the security officer for the base. And that, again, to make such a terrible miscalculation, to assume that something's an alien craft from another planet, and yet he kept his position there, and he served honorably. So, and behind the scenes, he wasn't getting. There were no repercussions for making a quote unquote mistake.
Right, and that is also interesting. And I like Jesse Marcel also as a witness for the believers, mm-hmm. but he's got one big area that I go after him in the book, mm-hmm. And this is what I would do in real life. I got him going down this path of he follows orders because, later in life he came out and he said, this because of following orders. So I lay the trap, follow orders. Why do you follow orders? Oh, they're so important. They're so important. Yeah. Okay, so tell me about the order that said you should take some of this material to your house. Right. It doesn't exist. It's a little bit of a mic drop moment because, he picked up materials and he showed it to his kids. So I would have a little bit of an angle of attack, but something interesting happened by what he did. He gave me an area, if this is a chess game, to kind of go mm-hmm. after him a little bit. However, he created more witnesses to the material that he ended up taking home.
Right.
You know what I mean? So that's an interesting.
But if I were trying to make the case for Roswell and putting him on the stand as a witness, that would actually be to my benefit, because the only reason he wouldn't follow protocol and bring the materials directly back to base and actually show them to his family is because he would have assumed it's outside the purview of their national security regulations and laws and protocols. Right? Because if it's something from off-world, there's nothing that he ever trained for that said, this is what you do when you find an alien craft, right? So he's not breaking any laws. He's not breaking any oaths or disobeying any commands, it would seem to me.
Yeah, and and not knowing what their actual procedures are, but that could be a very good argument by the defense. And just so like all your listeners know, and we all trial lawyers do it to varying degrees. But say, for example, that I am calling Jesse Marcel as the plaintiff or as the believer attorney. You know, you lay your foundation and the who are you and what are you and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then you almost immediately, so even though I'm calling him as my witness, I would immediately go into the, now you ended up taking some of this home, right? You have to address the client because I will spin it this way. And you took some home and now you get to, well, yeah, but it wasn't really clear what was going on. And then I can say, fair enough. And we move on. But you can imagine if the defense calls you, right, or Jesse Marcel is the witness, then it's the end of the world. And this, so you always get out in front of your own problems so that you can spin them your way.
Right. I can understand that. So that's the interesting thing about approaching this like a case, because you have to look at it from all those different angles. I really appreciate that. Do you think that that the skeptics that are out there, not the debunkers, like just like the legit, they believe themselves to be, just skeptical and don't believe in the Roswell UFO case. Do you think that they're convincible?
I do. I think with the right evidence, virtually anybody is convincible, right? Now, that would, this is more of a kind of a generic question. What, and everybody is going to have their sliding scale of what's acceptable evidence, and say, but, and then I hate to have the obvious answer of, well, yeah, if a UFO came and landed right now in your bag and everybody saw it, right, then they're going to be convincible. But I would, there probably isn't great. There are probably people that's what it's going to take, right? Would be the UFO in Alan's backyard, but most people, I have tried enough cases, and during the jury selection process, you can tell the folks that they don't want to be there and they know the law and this and that. And you can tell kind of by the way they're answering your questions. They're sort of like, oh, this is going to be a tough juror. Case is done. You get to do what's called poll the jury. You can ask them questions and stuff. The number of times that those jurors became like the jury foreperson. So they're convincible, but they just have a high standard, right? And they don't think you're gonna get there. And I've lost plenty of trials, and I've won plenty of trials, and that always seems to be the case. It's those people that are the toughest become the foreperson and really hold everyone's feet on the evidence and what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. If you're looking at it from a materials perspective, what evidence trail do you follow to find out where the UFOs went or where the material went?
Well, that's just it. Unless there's something, well, I'm sure there's lots of things that I don't know that other people know, but how do you track it? What the, Joe Public, the Alan and Chris's of the world, the version that we're packaged up with is the materials were sent to Wright Pat. And then in 1993, the next thing we're told is it's all been lost and gone and destroyed. That was in that Roswell case closed report that the government issued. So, and I wish I had an answer for you, but your guess is as good as mine on how to know any of it. It's above my pay grade.
But it seems to me if we were in a court case, because the Air Force and the Navy and have changed their tune about what happened and the explanation for it, would that be an advantage to you as a prosecutor?
Yes. Anytime stories change, it's a benefit to one side or the other, right? And you can say, for example, okay, first you said it was this, then it was Project Mogul, then there were no bodies, and then they were crash test dummies, kind of all along the way. Oh yeah, so absolutely, you'd go through step by step, just like I was mentioning with Mr. Hout, right? But you didn't have it here and you didn't have it here, and now it starts, popping up.
Yeah.
And even if we as the lawyers, so say you're on the stand and I can't get you to admit what we think we're doing, it's still evidence, and the jury is now, they'll give it the weight they think that it's worth. So some of the witnesses will think they're cute and not telling me the answer. Well, they're looking 10 times worse to the jury than they would have if they had just answered the question.
True, right? If indeed we reverse engineered these craft. Can you go back to those original witnesses and find out if that was true or not? Because you had Colonel Philip Corso, write his book about like disseminating pieces of technology to back engineer this alien technology. When you were researching, was there anything back then, the witnesses, the records, that led you to believe that any of that is true?
Nothing that I came across in preparation and research for this book.
Yeah.
That said, admittedly, it wasn't really an area that I was after. And I should point out, I intentionally, the evidence that I chose to include tended to be your more mainstream. Lots of folks have heard about it. The foil and the memory metal and the balsa wood and that. Kind of the same thing with my witnesses. I didn't want the cockadoodle guy who's so far one way or so far the other, because at the same time, I'm trying to tell a story, just the story of Roswell.
Is this are you warming us up? Are you planning on bringing a case against this government of the United States of America? Because I could see that happening.
Well, I'll tell you what, and that question comes up a lot.
Okay.
I would love to, I would be happy to, but procedurally, I don't know how. Because here's what you're going to run into. First, when you have a case, first of all, there has to be somebody or some party that has what's called standing, which means they have the right to bring the case. Okay, so that individual suffered some sort of damages. So first we'd have to find somebody that has actual standing.
Right.
Then we would have to find the proper agencies. And let's say just miracle, we found them all. Well, pretty hot button topic. I'm sure a lot of your listeners are at least somewhat familiar with the concept of immunity. Okay? And how immunity works when you're dealing with a government, so town, city, township, fire department, anything like that, by jurisdiction, and they're most the same. So I should point out your jurisdiction might be different, but typically there's two kinds of immunities. There's statutory immunity, where the law itself says, hey, if they do this, it's no big deal. And the other one is discretionary immunity. And that's the big immunity that everything gets scooped into, because let's say that the FBI has a policy that says, it uses words like can or might or may, that sort of language like that.
Sure.
They never have to show you anything, and they didn't do anything wrong because they have discretionary immunity on what it is they're doing. So that, I think, is the loop we'd keep getting thrown back into, is everybody's going to, one, it'll be so hard to find somebody who's standing, and then two, who you going to get, right? That's not immune.
Is that like, can you draw a parallel between that and like Elaine Ghislaine, oh my gosh.
Epstein's
yeah
confidant. So draw a parallel between those.
Ghislaine Maxwell, yeah. Because there's talk about her getting immunity, right?
Yeah, well, that's would be a different. I mean, immunity at its core is always the same, but right. So immunity for her, yeah, okay. Here's the parallel. Hey, come talk to us in Congress. You can tell us anything you want, and anything that you say, you're immune from prosecution. Okay, so virtually the same thing. Hey, FBI, you can do anything you want under your own discretion, if there's discretionary immunity, and you are immune from a civil case that Chris wants to bring against you.
Right.
So I think that the better approach would be a criminal case. I think you get further down the road on a criminal case. In the best kind of corollary, I know it's sort of a dry reference, but like Oliver North and the Iran-Contra, when all that went down in the 80s, we actually had criminal proceedings against governmental officials. And again, there's always a lot of immunities wrapped into those, and what would you charge them with, and what, in a criminal case, the government, the state, city, federal, somebody's got to bring the charges. So you'd have to find somebody to bring the charge and get, the correct person. And again, there has to be some damages out there, in damages. Sometimes people say to me, well, What about somebody that gets abducted? And if they had known, if the government had told them, maybe they would, it's just too tenuous. So someday something will happen, and I kick it around a lot, and I haven't hit upon the answer yet.
Could you bring a class action lawsuit? Because there are plenty of military witnesses that do feel they've been traumatized to some degree because of their exposure, and or the fact that they had to keep something a secret that they feels unconstitutional.
Again, it would class actions. I've done quite a few of those. Issue with when you have a class action. So in a case like this, let's say you're my co-counsel and we managed to get this thing far enough down the road on this class action. Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing the court say what you have to do is you have to certify a class. So you and I, as the good plaintiff lawyers, we would be saying the class is everyone in the U.S. government, from this time to this time that may have heard the word UFO, right? That's our class. Okay. Well, the government's going to be over there going, no, your class is the one guy that got PTSD and actually went to the doctor for it and has some damages. And you start refining from there because one side wants the big class, the other side wants the little.
So it's almost like a negotiation.
It can be, and sometimes it'll end up with we'll get it down to everything but two, and then you got to go in front of the judge and go, you got to decide because we can't agree. So again, in that issue of damages, it's okay. Well, the government has information they're not telling us. Well, first they're going to be immune on that, and two, you don't really have any damages. And I get what you're saying. It would be. The right case, maybe a better way to put it this way, the right case will eventually come along, mm-hmm. and all of us smart lawyers that are plugged into this topic are going to know it. But thus far, it hasn't happened.
So the Whistleblower Protection Act,
yes,
if it were to be passed with inclusion to protect whistleblowers, mm-hmm. can they then testify openly without consequence?
I would say a good lawyer answer, probably. And I know you're probably referring to Danny Sheehan in the Paradigm Institute. He's the lawyer really leading the charge on the disclosure issues, and he's got lobbyists on the payroll and the whole bit. Mm-hmm. I would imagine that's what the language is, but I haven't seen the proposed bill. I haven't read the language, so I can't say. But typically, that would be the deal. And you talk about compromising. Heck, even if it was only to the skiffs, even maybe not consumable for you and me yet, but let's get something going here.
Yeah. In your book, is there like a protagonist, an anti-hero? Like who's driving this story?
The mystery drives the story.
Driving. I like that. Okay.
I made that up. There's no protagonist. There's no mm-hmm. antagonist, unless I suppose you're a dyed-in-the-wool believer, you're a dyed-in-the-wool skeptic, right? Because mm-hmm. you're immediately going to go, I know about this Mac Brazel guy and he this or she that. So, but no, it's simply a fact-based narrative retelling via direct and cross exam of the Roswell incident.
Okay. Have you seen a UFO?
I haven't seen one, but I have an interesting story. I'll tell you.
I'd love to hear it. Yeah.
Okay. So this is my experience. This was 1991, and I was 22 years old at the time, and I was single, and I was living with roommates. That kind of just that time of life, right? And at the time, this is way before I ever went to law school, and I was working as a manager at this hotel. And we had this Christmas party on just outside. There's this nice bar in the backside of the hotel. And like I said, I was really young, and so I had just read this book on how to be a good manager. They talked about for Christmas parties, and this is important. They said for Christmas parties, you should go so your employees see you, maybe have one drink, then you get out of there. So you've made your appearance and they can still have fun. So that is exactly what I did. And I had one beer from a pitcher. So some of my employees were sharing a pitcher. I had one beer out of that pitcher and I left. The next morning, I got up. I remembered leaving the bar And that was it. I went upstairs and one of my roommates starts in, "What'd you do last night?" I'm like, "What do you know?" He said that I got home at 4 o'clock in the morning. I go to work. I talked to those employees. They said I left the bar at 9 o'clock at night. Okay. So I have this missing time. And the only memories, I had flashes of memories of being out in a field. That was it. And when I went out, when I went out to the driveway, up under my fenders and up in the wheel wells, just weeds and tall grasses and all kinds of stuff. So that's a fact. The memory is a fact. What happened to my car is a fact. And that I left at 9 and came home at 4. Those are facts. What happened in between, I don't know. But
that is bizarre.
Yeah, really weird. Really
Have
weird.
you ever tried hypnosis?
I would love to. I absolutely, the regressive hypnosis. I did do hypnosis to quit smoking 25 years ago.
It worked.
Yeah.
I had to do it. I tried it. I was on and off a few times. I finally did it cold turkey.
Ooh, good for you. Good for you. So, but
I tried the patch. Patch didn't work. That was,
yeah. Truth be told, I kind of was still, and I'm into the Velos, the Vela Zins every now and then, but still better than cigarettes. So, but no, I would love to do some of that regressive hypnosis and just see what's there. Cause I've been living with that mystery. Maybe the mystery is more fun. I don't know, but that was my experience.
I think it's best because that I always sign off with, live in the mystery. Cause I think there's something quintessentially human about having an element of mystery about the nature of reality. For me, right. I really enjoy living in that space. It's the like the campfire stories, right? There's just something having those mythologies.
Yeah.
And so I think that, that absolutely makes sense. But we are creatures that create and build and make and develop. And so we do need some satisfaction. We do need some resolution on certain things. Yeah. So I would like to get more of that. I don't think we're going to get all the big questions answered in the next 50, 100 years. Right. But I think that we need to know, like, what is visiting us? What is coming here? What's happening?
Well, my opinion on the ultimate disclosure, I think, for whatever that's worth, I think it is going to happen. I think it's going to happen in my lifetime. And like I said, I'm 55, but I think it's going to be because of something the extraterrestrials do and nothing that the government, certainly nothing the U.S. government does. Now give me Chile, Peru, France, some of these more progressive countries on the UAP topic, maybe there, but I believe it's going to be something that, it cannot be ignored or denied, and the government will play no role in it, except maybe trying to spin it after the fact.
How did you close the case? Or do you not want to give that away in your book?
I closed the case as one closes trials, which is closing arguments.
And what's your closing argument?
I could read for you, but I presented
generally.
Generally. Oh, okay. That's a big ask. So first, I got to get my procedure straight, first and last. So the skeptics would close first. Okay, and then the believers close.
Okay, so everybody in chat, you're the jury. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so the skeptics, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, counsel, Your Honor, I'd like to thank you for the time that we've spent here over the last X amount of time hearing this case. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, as I just said, we heard this case, and what did we hear? We heard a crazy story that somebody, an uneducated ranch hand thought was part of a UFO. We had a public information officer ridiculously caught up in the hype that it was a UFO. Fortuitously, we have who? General Ramey over here in the full uniform. And fortunately, General Ramey was able to set the stage for us and told us, unfortunately, the government made a mistake on this one. And what do we know that's true? People make mistakes. Ladies and gentlemen, this was not an extraterrestrial craft. It was simply a case of mistaken identity, and I would ask you to find accordingly. Thank you. All right, he sits down. Now we got the plaintiff or the believer's attorney. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, counsel, Your Honor. As my colleague said, I too thank you for your service here over the last few days. Trial jury duty isn't always fun, but it is our civic duty, so we appreciate that. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to pay attention to some of the words that counsel used in his closing argument. Ridiculous, silly. Well, we know this isn't ridiculous and this isn't silly. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. And then I differentiate us from them, we take this topic seriously. We are here to ask the hard questions, and we provided the answers to those hard questions. What did we provide? Well, you remember Mac Brazel, the simple ranch hand who first found the materials. You remember his neighbor, Loretta Proctor. See, now we're talking about like your basic people. Yeah. You remember Jesse Marcel in the two different photographs, right? Present the photographs. And now they want you to believe that General Ramey, and this is how I would turn this back, even with all those medals and all that experience, he just made a mistake. Nothing to see here, folks. Let's move on. Well, what do we know about that? We know that's a bunch of hogwash. Why? Because we've been told by witness, right down the list. And they were all consistent in what they told us. Imagine you have a scale, ladies and gentlemen, and you're putting a peppercorn on either side of the scale, one side for the believers and one for the skeptics. If one side tips even a peppercorn more one way than the other, in this civil case, you must find for that party. And I would tell you in this case, the scale for the believers isn't a peppercorn grader. It's an entire pepper grader. This was an extraterrestrial craft, and we would ask you to find accordingly. Thank you. So something roughly like that off the cuff.
That's awesome. I love it. Thank you for doing that, Chris.
Sure, thanks.
Yeah. Have you ever spoken at any conferences or the like?
I haven't, and I tried. I'm a member of MUFON. I wanted to do their convention. It's just here in July, but I was kind of late to the table. Yeah. So I am making this shameless plug. I'm always happy and I'm always looking, and I will speak pretty much anywhere, anytime.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm in MUFON as well as an investigator, and recently a part of the Experiencer Resource team. And I have been really wanting to go to a MUFON conference, but it's in Ohio. And we're on the East Coast. We just I can't get out there. It's just not convenient, not doable. I'm just dying for one to come back out here to the Northeast at some point, or at least Northeast-ish. So if you could leave us with one thought, like something about this that you really feel needs to be highlighted or discussed, what would it be?
Yes. Thank you for asking that question. I just want to take a note of it. If from this book, if one person in the world reads beyond a headline, whereas otherwise they might have just read the headline and moved on. If one person exhibits critical thinking that they otherwise might not have because of my book, mission accomplished. As we said, Alan, words are important. Look at the words. I can tie it into the congressional hearings, and everyone was jumping up and down about David Koresh. You know what I heard? I heard 42 examples of hearsay, right? Yes, there's things I can tell you in the skiff, but just to my point, be a careful consumer of information. Look at what is being said, check your own sources. Don't just be a drive-by media, and I think if we all are better educated and we all do that and can hold people's feet to the fire a little bit better, because I think we think we're getting information, but it's not, it's worthless. So be a little more critical.
Yes. Be more scrutinous with what you consume. I agree with that 100%. I mean, part of my not spending so much time on social media anymore is one, like I just think I feel like I can focus a little bit better. My brain feels a little bit more clear, but also it is frustrating. You come across a post or people tag you on things, and then I have to take the time to go and like fact check it, and so many times it's like, oh my gosh, I spent all this time and it's not real. It's, I got worked up emotionally, whatever it is. So I spend very little time lately on social media. How do you feel about social media and its role in UFOs and UAP?
I think like anything on the internet, its ability to transmit information, fantastic. However, the information that gets transmitted, as you just said, it alluded to, my estimation, 99.9% of it's absolute garbage. But I think the good thing is, of that 99.9, about 99.9, it's so obvious from the headline that it's garbage. You got a misspelling or some incorrect grammar in your headline. I'm pretty much guessing the rest of this story is not going to be a whole lot better. So, yeah, good and bad, right? Because you get the information out, and then it does, if you're conscientious like you are, like I am, yeah, then you're fact checking, and and then everybody's got different opinions. So it's tough, but it's not going anywhere.
All right, and the last question of the night:
Yeah.
if extraterrestrials landed and sent a delegation down, and they have their legal representatives, and the U.S. sends you as one of their legal representatives.
Right.
How do you initiate conversation with this other species from another planet? Thinking like a lawyer, like I need to be safe about how I'm saying things, being diplomatic.
Yeah, I think whether I was approaching it as an attorney or not, I'm of that mindset. Again, not that this is original. If extraterrestrials wished us any harm, it'd have been done, and there's zero that we can do about it, right? Because they have the ability to come here, we don't have the ability to go there. So they got a big leg up on us. I look at it, if I was tasked with that, I think that I would go in, I would study with body language experts, and I would go in as the most submissive man you have ever probably met in your life, and I would let them drive the conversation. Because
really? Okay.
First, I don't think me, Chris Johnston, certainly, but I don't think any man or woman or earthling should be so bold as to, we're equals, we're peers.
Sure.
Not if they got the technology to do what they're doing. We are not equals and peers, and I don't want them upset in any way.
And there's also the fact of what you don't know, right?
Yeah, that too. Yeah, so yes, very submissively, that's how I would do it.
All right. That's awesome. So I put the link in the chat for your book, Roswell Truth on Trial. And where else can they find your work? Or
thanks for asking. So the book's available on Amazon, and it's also available, this is my shameless plug, if you were to go to my law firm website, this one for where I am is lawgroupofiowa.com. About halfway down on the homepage, picture of the book, big red button, buy Chris's book. But a nice thing on the website, there's also my professional bio, and people can see that I actually do real lawyer work, and some of what I'm into. And
Iowa Supreme Court cases too, right?
Yep, that is correct. So,
awesome. Thanks, Chris. I really appreciate you being on. This is fantastic.
Yeah, I appreciate your time.
Absolutely. So hopefully we'll bump into each other again. In the meantime, everyone, please check out Chris's work. And I want to thank the UnX Network, Race Hobbs and Margie K, for rebroadcasting this on their network every week. And a special thank you to Dan Harari at the Hollywood Disclosure Alliance, of which Chris and I are both members. Go and check that out. He's got a great newsletter for all UAP related news and a number of other events that he is putting together. All right. Peace and love, everyone. That's it. Thank you, everyone in chat. It's great to see you guys. Until next time, live in the mystery.